The snow was falling harder than Sarah Mitchell had seen in 20 years when she heard the sound that would change 3 lives forever. It wasn't the howling wind or the creaking of her old farmhouse settling in the bitter cold. It was something else, something that shouldn't have been coming from her detached garage at 247. In the morning, what she discovered when she grabbed her flashlight and trudged through the knee-deep snow would test every principle she'd been raised with, challenge her financially beyond her means, and ultimately prove that sometimes the most unexpected acts of kindness create ripple effects that transform entire communities. But before we dive into that life-changing moment, you need to understand who Sarah Mitchell was and why the decision she made that freezing February night would surprise everyone who knew her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Mitchell had always been the type of person who noticed things others missed. At 34, she possessed the kind of quiet observational skills that came from years of caring for people who couldn't care for themselves. Her days began at 5:30 a.m. with the sound of her phone alarm, not because she had somewhere important to be, but because her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, needed help with her morning medications at the small town of Millbrook, Ohio. Population 3,847. Wasn't the kind of place where professional caregiving services thrived. Most families either moved their elderly relatives to facilities in larger cities or relied on neighbors, church members, and the occasional visiting nurse. Sarah had somehow become the unofficial caregiver for half the senior citizens in town, not through any formal arrangement, but because she'd never learned how to say no when someone needed help. Her own house, a modest 2-bedroom structure built in 1952, sat on the outskirts of Millbrook on what used to be her grandfather's farm. The property had been whittled down over the years, sold off piece by piece to pay for her mother's cancer treatments and later her father's funeral expenses. What remained was the main house, badly in need of roof repairs, a detached garage that hadn't housed a car in 15 years, and 5 acres of land that she couldn't afford to maintain properly. Sarah's financial situation was precarious in ways that would have alarmed anyone who took a close look at her monthly budget. Her income came from a patchwork of part-time work, 20 hours a week at Henderson's General Store, occasional shifts at the local diner when someone called in sick, and informal caregiving for 7 different elderly residents who paid her what they could afford. On a good month, she might bring in $1,800. On a bad month, when Mrs. Pemberton's Social Security was delayed or when the general store cut hours, she might see half that amount. The house itself was a constant source of both comfort and anxiety. It held memories of 3 generations of Mitchells, from her grandparents who'd built it with their own hands, to her parents who'd raised her there with values of hard work and community service. But memories didn't pay for heating bills or grocery expenses. And the old farmhouse was energy efficient in the way that most 1950s construction was, which is to say, not at all. During the winter months, Sarah had developed a routine of heating only the kitchen and her bedroom, closing off the rest of the house and wearing layers of clothing that made her look bulkier than she actually was. She'd mastered the art of cooking meals that stretched ingredients as far as possible, soup that started with 1 chicken breast and fed her for 4 days, casseroles built around whatever vegetables were marked down at the grocery store, and the kind of creative poverty cooking that her grandmother had taught her during childhood visits. Her vehicle, a 2003 Honda Civic with 247,000 miles and a passenger door that only opened from the outside, represented her single largest asset and her biggest vulnerability. If the car died, her ability to reach her various employers and the elderly people who depended on her would disappear overnight. She'd been setting aside $25 a month for car repairs, an amount that seemed both insufficient and all she could manage, but Sarah's financial struggles were only part of the story. The more significant aspect of her life was the way she'd become woven into the fabric of Millbrook's senior community. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, 87 years old with advancing dementia, had no family members living within 200 miles. Sarah checked on her twice daily, organized her medications, and served as her advocate during medical appointments. There was Harold Finnegan, a diabetic veteran who needed help monitoring his blood sugar and preparing appropriate meals. Martha and Thomas Caldwell, married for 63 years, who could no longer manage their household independently but refused to consider moving to assisted living. Each of these relationships had developed organically. Sarah would notice someone struggling at the grocery store and offer to help carry their bags. She'd see a neighbor having difficulty with yard work and volunteer her Saturday afternoon. Before long, she'd become an essential part of people's daily survival, providing services that family members would typically handle if they lived nearby or weren't dealing with their own overwhelming responsibilities. The emotional weight of this caregiving role was something Sarah rarely discussed with anyone. She'd become the person people called when they were scared, confused, or facing medical emergencies. She'd sat in hospital waiting rooms during emergency surgeries, held hands during difficult diagnoses, and been present for conversations about end-of-life planning that adult children should have been having but weren't available for. Her social life had gradually diminished as her caregiving responsibilities expanded. Friends from high school had moved away or gotten married and started families. The few relationships she'd attempted over the years had floundered when potential partners realized that her phone might ring at any hour with genuine emergencies. That took priority over dinner plans or weekend getaways. Sarah had reached a point where she sometimes felt invisible in her own life, so focused on meeting other people's needs that she'd forgotten what her own needs even were. She couldn't remember the last time she'd bought herself anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Her clothes came from thrift stores or were gifts from elderly clients who decided to downsize their wardrobes. Her entertainment consisted of library books and whatever was available on the basic cable package that came with her internet service. But despite the isolation and financial stress, Sarah had found genuine purpose in her caregiving work. There was satisfaction in helping Mrs. Pemberton have dignified days despite her memory loss, in ensuring that Harold's diabetes remained controlled, in enabling the Caldwells to remain in their own home for as long as possible. She'd become skilled at advocating with doctors, insurance companies, and social service agencies on behalf of people who could no longer navigate these systems independently. The town itself had begun to take Sarah's services for granted in ways that were both touching and problematic. When someone's elderly parent needed help, Sarah Mitchell's name was invariably mentioned as someone who might be able to assist. The local pharmacy knew to call her when medications weren't picked up on schedule. The emergency medical technicians had her contact information because she often knew more about her clients' medical histories and current conditions than their official emergency contacts did. This reputation had created a peculiar kind of security and vulnerability. Sarah was valued and needed, but also taken for granted and underpaid. People assumed she would always be available because she'd never said no to a request for help. They appreciated her services but didn't necessarily understand the personal and financial sacrifices required to provide them. As February 2024 brought one of the harshest winters Ohio had experienced in decades, Sarah's situation had become increasingly precarious. The heating costs for her poorly insulated house were consuming nearly half her monthly income. Her car had developed a troubling rattling sound that she couldn't afford to have diagnosed, much less repaired. 2 of her elderly clients had been hospitalized with flu complications, reducing her already modest income. She'd been surviving on peanut butter sandwiches and canned soup for 3 weeks, telling herself that spring would bring improvement even as she struggled to see how her circumstances could realistically change. The physical and emotional demands of caregiving were wearing her down. But she couldn't imagine abandoning the people who depended on her, even if maintaining her current level of service was pushing her toward her own crisis. It was in this context of quiet desperation and stubborn determination that Sarah Mitchell found herself awake at 2:47 a.m. on February 14th, listening to sounds coming from her garage that would force her to make decisions she'd never imagined facing. The woman who had spent years caring for others was about to discover that sometimes the most profound acts of service come when you have the least to give. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sound came again at 2:52 a.m., a low whimpering that cut through the howling wind like a knife through Sarah's consciousness. She'd been lying in bed, wrapped in 3 blankets and wearing thermal underwear beneath her pajamas, trying to ignore the cold draft seeping through her bedroom window frame. The heating bill had forced her to keep the thermostat at 58 degrees, and even with her bedroom door closed and a space heater running, the February cold seemed to find every crack and crevice in the old house. Sarah sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound wasn't coming from inside the house. It wasn't the wind, which had been battering Ohio for 3 days straight, bringing with it temperatures that hadn't been seen in Millbrook since the winter of 1978. This was something else entirely. Something that sounded almost like crying. She reached for her phone on the nightstand, squinting at the bright screen. No missed calls from any of her elderly clients, though that didn't necessarily mean anything. Mrs. Pemberton sometimes forgot how to use her phone during episodes of confusion, and Harold Finnegan was too proud to call for help even when his blood sugar dropped dangerously low. The sound came a third time, clearer now, and Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate. It was definitely coming from outside, somewhere in the direction of her detached garage. The building had been her grandfather's workshop decades ago, then her father's storage space, and was now essentially an expensive shed that she couldn't afford to heat, but couldn't bring herself to tear down. Sarah's first instinct was to ignore it. She'd learned over the years that investigating strange, nighttime sounds often led to expensive problems she couldn't afford to solve. Last spring, unusual noises had turned out to be a family of raccoons that had cost her $400 to remove professionally. The winter before, mysterious sounds had revealed ice damage that required roof repairs she'd had to put on a credit card. But this sound was different. There was something heartbreakingly human about it, a quality that reminded her of the way Mrs. Pemberton cried during her worst moments of confusion and fear. Sarah found herself throwing back the covers. Before she'd consciously decided to investigate, she dressed quickly in the darkness, pulling on jeans over her thermal underwear, adding 2 sweaters and her father's old work coat. Her boots were by the back door, heavy insulated things that had belonged to her grandfather and were 2 sizes too large for her feet. She grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer, the heavy metal one that took 4D batteries and could illuminate half an acre when necessary. The cold hit her like a physical blow the moment she opened the back door. The wind was brutal, carrying snow that felt like tiny ice pellets against her exposed skin. The temperature had to be well below 0, the kind of cold that could kill someone in a matter of hours if they were exposed without proper protection. Sarah's property was laid out in a way that made the garage invisible from the main house. Her grandfather had positioned it behind a grove of pine trees that provided a windbreak during storms, but also blocked the view. As she trudged through snow that came up to her mid-thigh, following the barely visible path that led from her back door to the outbuilding, Sarah found herself wondering who could possibly be out in weather like this. The garage itself was a sturdy structure, built from the same fieldstone and timber that characterized most of the farm buildings in this part of Ohio. Her grandfather had constructed it to last, with thick walls and a solid foundation, but he'd never bothered with insulation or heating. The building had two large doors that faced away from the prevailing wind, and a smaller side door that Sarah used when she needed to retrieve something from storage. As she approached the building, the sound became unmistakable. Someone was inside her garage, and they were in distress. Sarah's mind raced through possibilities, none of them particularly comforting. Millbrook wasn't the kind of town where violent crime was common, but desperate people sometimes did desperate things, especially during harsh weather. She thought about returning to the house and calling the police, but the nearest station was 20 miles away, and response times during snowstorms could stretch to hours. The crying sound came again, weaker now, and Sarah made her decision. She approached the side door of the garage and knocked firmly. "Hello," she called out, raising her voice to be heard over the wind. "Is someone in there? Do you need help?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a different sound shuffling movement, as if someone was trying to hide or prepare for confrontation. Sarah waited, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. "I'm not going to hurt you," she called out. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. This is my property, but if you need help, I want to help you." Silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then, barely audible through the thick wooden door, came a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone very old and very tired. "Please." The voice said, "We're not criminals. We just needed somewhere warm." Sarah's hand found the door handle, an old-fashioned latch that her grandfather had installed decades ago. She took a deep breath and lifted the flashlight, preparing for whatever she might find inside. The beam of light revealed a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Huddled in the far corner of the garage, surrounded by old paint cans and garden tools covered in dust, was an elderly man who appeared to be in his 70s or 80s. He was wrapped in what looked like several layers of inadequate clothing, a thin jacket, multiple shirts, and pants that were clearly meant for warmer weather. His gray hair was matted, his face was red from cold exposure, and his lips had taken on a bluish tinge that Sarah recognized as an early sign of hypothermia. But what broke her heart completely were the two dogs pressed against him, clearly trying to share whatever warmth they could provide. One was a medium-sized mixed breed with brown and white markings, the other a smaller dog that might have been part beagle. Both animals were shivering violently, their fur damp from melted snow, their eyes reflecting the flashlight beam with an expression of fear and exhaustion that made Sarah's chest tighten with emotion. "Oh my God," Sarah breathed, stepping into the garage and letting the door close behind her. "How long have you been out here?" The old man tried to speak, but his voice came out as a croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Since yesterday afternoon. We were walking to the next town, but the storm got worse, and we couldn't see the road anymore. Your garage door was open a crack, and we just needed somewhere to get out of the wind." Sarah quickly assessed the situation with the practical eye of someone who'd spent years dealing with medical emergencies. The man was clearly suffering from exposure, possibly hypothermia. His breathing was shallow, his movements sluggish, and his speech was slightly slurred, all warning signs that his core body temperature had dropped to dangerous levels. The dogs weren't in much better condition, their shivering violent enough to be visible in the flashlight beam. "What's your name?" Sarah asked, moving closer but being careful not to make any sudden movements that might frighten them. "Robert," the man replied. "Robert Henley. These are my dogs, Charlie and Rosie. We've been traveling for ... I guess it's been about a week now." Sarah knelt down, noting that the concrete floor of the garage was radiating cold that would have made their situation even more dangerous. "Robert, you and your dogs are going to die if you stay out here. The temperature's dropped below zero, and it's supposed to get colder." Robert's eyes filled with tears, and Sarah realized that he already knew how dire their situation was. "No," he whispered. "I just didn't know what else to do. We don't have anywhere to go." The simple honesty of his statement hit Sarah like a physical blow. Here was a man who had clearly reached the end of his resources, who had been traveling in winter weather with 2 dogs and no adequate shelter, who had broken into her garage not out of malicious intent, but out of pure desperation. Sarah found herself facing a decision that would change 3 lives forever. She could call the authorities, which would likely result in Robert being taken to a homeless shelter if one was available, and his dogs being taken to an animal control facility, where their fate would be uncertain. She could offer them temporary shelter until the storm passed, which would strain her already limited resources but might save their lives. Or she could try to find some middle ground that addressed the immediate crisis without committing to long-term responsibility. But as she looked at Robert's face, lined with exhaustion and resignation, and at the 2 dogs who were clearly devoted to him and depended on his care, Sarah realized that there was really only one choice she could live with. "Can you walk?" she asked Robert. "I'm going to take you and your dogs into my house where it's warm. We'll figure out everything else after you're safe." Robert stared at her as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "Ma'am, I can't ask you to do that. You don't know us." You might be a lot of things," Sarah interrupted gently. "But right now you're a man and 2 dogs who are going to freeze to death in my garage if I don't help you. Everything else we can sort out later." She helped Robert to his feet, noting how unsteady he was and how much effort the simple movement required. The dogs seemed to understand that something was changing. They stood close to Robert, but watched Sarah with cautious hope, as if they'd learned not to expect good things, but couldn't quite give up the possibility. Getting the 3 of them from the garage to her house proved more challenging than Sarah had anticipated. Robert could barely walk through the deep snow, and the dogs struggled to navigate drifts that were deeper than they were tall. Sarah found herself essentially carrying first one dog, then the other, while supporting Robert's weight as they made their way slowly toward her back door. By the time they reached the house, all 4 of them were exhausted and covered in snow. Sarah's hands were numb despite her gloves, and she could see that Robert was worse than when they'd started. The brief exposure to the brutal wind had taken whatever energy reserves he had left. As Sarah opened her back door and guided them into the warmth of her kitchen, she realized that she just made a decision that would test every aspect of her character, her resources, and her faith in the idea that doing the right thing would somehow work out in the end. Robert collapsed into one of her kitchen chairs, while Charlie and Rosie huddled together on her kitchen floor, their tails tucked between their legs, but their eyes beginning to show the first signs of hope. Sarah looked at the 3 creatures she'd just rescued and wondered what she'd gotten herself into. But as she watched, Robert's breathing began to steady and saw the dog start to relax in the warmth of her kitchen, Sarah knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she'd made the only choice she could live with. The woman who had spent her life caring for others had just taken on the biggest caregiving challenge of her career, and she had no idea how she was going to manage it. The immediate aftermath of bringing Robert and his dogs into her house hit Sarah like a series of practical bombs she hadn't had time to consider during the life-or-death urgency of the rescue. As the kitchen door closed behind them, sealing out the brutal February wind, she found herself facing 3 creatures in various stages of hypothermia, exhaustion, and malnutrition in a house she could barely afford to heat for 1 person. Robert had slumped in her kitchen chair, his breathing shallow and his skin an alarming shade of gray-blue. The dogs, Charlie and Rosie, remained huddled together on her linoleum floor, their violent shivering creating a sound like chattering teeth. Water from melted snow was pooling around all of them, and Sarah realized that her first priority had to be getting everyone warm and dry before she could even begin to assess the full scope of what she'd taken on. "Robert," she said gently, kneeling beside his chair, "I need you to stay awake for me. Can you tell me if you're hurt anywhere? Are you in pain?" His eyes focused on her with visible effort. "Just cold," he managed. "So cold I can't feel my feet." anymore. Sarah had seen enough cases of hypothermia during her years of caregiving to know that Robert's condition was serious, but not immediately life-threatening now that he was out of the wind. However, rewarming someone who'd been exposed to extreme cold required careful attention to prevent shock or cardiac complications. "I'm going to run a warm bath," she told him. "Not hot, just warm. You need to get out of those wet clothes and gradually bring your body temperature back to normal." As she spoke, Sarah was already calculating the cost of running enough hot water for a full bath, plus the additional heating that would be required to warm her house enough to be safe for someone in Robert's condition. The numbers weren't encouraging, but she pushed those concerns aside. She could worry about money after she'd prevented anyone from dying in her kitchen. The dogs presented their own set of challenges. Both animals were clearly undernourished, their ribs visible through damp fur, their eyes holding the wary watchfulness of creatures who'd learned that food and shelter were never guaranteed. They stayed close to Robert, but watched Sarah with a mixture of hope and suspicion that broke her heart. "Charlie, Rosie," she said softly, using the names Robert had provided. "Let's get you two warmed up too." Sarah grabbed every towel she owned from her linen closet, which wasn't many, and began the process of drying the dogs while keeping one eye on Robert. Charlie, the larger mixed breed, submitted to being toweled off with resigned patience, while Rosie, the smaller beagle mix, trembled so violently that Sarah worried she might be injured as she worked. Sarah's mind raced through the immediate challenges she faced. Food was the most pressing concern after warmth. She had perhaps 3 days' worth of groceries in her house, calculated to last one person until her next paycheck. Feeding 3 additional mouths, including 2 dogs who probably hadn't eaten regularly in days, would exhaust her supplies immediately. Then, there was the question of sleeping arrangements. Her house had 2 bedrooms, but one had been closed off all winter to save on heating costs and was currently uninhabitable without significant preparation. Her own bedroom was barely warm enough for one person, and the living room, while heated, wasn't set up for overnight guests. But the most overwhelming question was what happened beyond the immediate crisis. Robert clearly wasn't just someone who needed help getting through a storm. His condition, his lack of adequate winter clothing, and his presence on the road with 2 dogs in February suggested a much larger problem than temporary displacement. "Robert," Sarah said as she helped him stand up from the kitchen chair, "before we get you warmed up, I need to ask you something important. Do you have family I should call? Someone who's worried about you?" Robert's expression crumpled, and for a moment Sarah thought he might collapse again. "No," he said quietly. "There's nobody to call." The simple finality of that statement contained a world of implications that Sarah wasn't ready to fully comprehend. She guided Robert toward her bathroom, supporting his weight as he moved with the uncertain steps of someone whose circulation was just beginning to return. "We'll talk more after you're warm," she said, though part of her was dreading that conversation. While Robert soaked in a carefully monitored warm bath, Sarah turned her attention to the dogs and the question of food. Her refrigerator contained the remnants of a chicken she'd bought on sale the week before, some eggs that were approaching their expiration date, and various leftovers that she'd been stretching as far as possible. Her pantry held rice, beans, pasta, and the kind of basic staples that could be combined into multiple meals with creativity and determination. She decided to start with the chicken, pulling the remaining meat off the bones and warming it in a pan with some rice. The dogs watched her every movement with intense focus, their noses switching at the smell of cooking food. When she placed bowls of the chicken and rice mixture on the floor, both animals looked at her as if asking permission before falling on the food with desperate hunger that confirmed Sarah's suspicion about how long it had been since their last real meal. As the dogs ate, Sarah took inventory of her situation with the kind of brutal honesty that poverty had taught her. She had approximately $180 in her checking account, which was supposed to last until her next payday in 5 days. Her pantry contained maybe $40 worth of food if she shopped carefully and avoided any protein more expensive than eggs or dried beans. Her heating bill was already straining her budget, and warming the house enough to be safe for someone recovering from hypothermia would likely double her February utility costs. On paper, taking in 3 additional mouths was financial suicide. Sarah was already walking a tightrope between survival and disaster, and adding Robert and his dogs to her responsibilities would almost certainly push her over the edge into the kind of crisis that could cost her the house, her ability to care for her elderly clients, and her fragile stability. But as she watched Charlie and Rosie finish their meal and curl up together near her space heater, and as she heard Robert moving around in the bathroom with the slow, careful movements of someone whose body was remembering how to function normally, Sarah realized that the mathematical realities of her situation were irrelevant. These 3 creatures had been hours away from death when she found them. Robert was someone's father, grandfather, or brother, a man with a lifetime of experiences and relationships, who had somehow ended up alone and homeless in the worst winter Ohio had seen in decades. Charlie and Rosie were loyal companions who had stayed with Robert through whatever circumstances had led them to her garage, providing what comfort they could even as they faced their own mortality. Sarah couldn't save them temporarily and then send them back out into the world that had failed them so completely. But she also couldn't ignore the reality that her resources were insufficient for the responsibility she'd just assumed. When Robert emerged from the bathroom wearing her father's old bathrobe and looking significantly more human, Sarah was waiting for him with a cup of hot tea and a bowl of the same chicken and rice she'd given the dogs. He sat at her kitchen table with the careful movements of someone who still wasn't entirely steady, but his color had improved dramatically and his eyes were clear and focused. "Thank you," he said simply, and a weight of genuine gratitude in those 2 words made Sarah's throat tighten with emotion. "You're welcome," she replied. "But Robert, we need to talk about what happens next. I want to help you, but I need to understand your situation so I can figure out how to do that." Robert nodded, wrapping his hands around the warm mug of tea, as if it were a lifeline. "I suppose you deserve to know what kind of trouble you've taken on." Over the next hour, as the wind continued to howl outside and the dogs slept peacefully by the heater, Robert told Sarah a story that was both heartbreakingly specific and tragically common. He was 73 years old, a retired factory worker who had spent 42 years at the same plant in Cleveland before it closed down 5 years earlier. His wife of 48 years, Helen, had died of cancer 2 years ago, leaving medical bills that had consumed their savings and forced him to sell their house. He'd been living in a small apartment, surviving on Social Security, when a rent increase he couldn't afford had forced him out 6 weeks ago. "I tried staying in shelters," Robert explained, his voice steady but his eyes reflecting pain that went deeper than physical discomfort. "But most of them don't allow dogs, and I couldn't. Abandoned Charlie and Rosie. Helen and I raised them from puppies. They're all I have left of the life we built together." Sarah found herself thinking about the impossible choices that poverty forced on people. Robert had chosen homelessness over abandoning his dogs, a decision that spoke to his character, but had nearly cost all 3 of them their lives. "Where were you trying to get to when the storm hit?" she asked. "Nowhere specific," Robert admitted. "I heard there might be work at a farm outside of town, someone who needed help with winter chores, in exchange for housing. But I think I got the directions wrong, and when the snow started falling so hard, I couldn't see the road anymore." Sarah absorbed this information while calculating the impossibilities of Robert's situation. At 73, with no permanent address and 2 dogs, his employment options were severely limited. Shelters and assistance programs had rules and waiting lists that didn't accommodate his circumstances. The social safety net that was supposed to catch people like Robert was full of holes large enough for a man and 2 dogs to fall through completely. "Robert," she said finally, "I'm going to be honest with you about my situation, because I think we need to figure this out together." She explained her own financial constraints, her caregiving responsibilities, and the reality that she was barely managing to support herself, let alone 3 additional dependents. But she also made clear that she wasn't asking him to leave, just trying to be realistic about the challenges they faced. Robert listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled with each detail of Sarah's struggles. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "I can't let you sacrifice your stability for us," he said finally. "You've already saved our lives. If you can just let us stay until the storm passes, I'll figure out something else." "Like what?" Sarah asked gently. "Robert, it's supposed to snow for 3 more days, and even after it stops, you don't have anywhere to go that's any safer than where you started." The truth of that statement hung in the air between them. Sarah had rescued Robert and his dogs from immediate death, but she hadn't rescued them from the circumstances that had led them to her garage in the first place. As the clock on her kitchen wall ticked past 5 a.m., Sarah realized that she was facing a decision that would define the kind of person she was. She could provide temporary shelter and then help Robert connect with social services, hoping that some other solution would emerge. Or she could commit to a path that would strain her resources beyond their limits, but might offer Robert and his dogs the security and dignity they deserved. Looking at Robert's weathered face, and the 2 dogs sleeping peacefully for the first time in who knew how long, Sarah found herself leaning toward a choice that made no financial sense, but felt absolutely right in every other way. The woman who had spent her adult life caring for people who couldn't care for themselves was about to discover whether her community would support her when she needed help to continue serving others, or whether acts of extraordinary kindness were expected to be private sacrifices that didn't burden anyone else. By 7 a.m., Sarah had made a decision that defied every practical consideration but aligned with every value her parents had instilled in her. As she watched Robert sleep fitfully on her living room couch, covered with every spare blanket she owned, while Charlie and Rosie maintained their protective positions on the floor beside him, she knew there was no way she could send them back into the world that had already failed them so completely. The decision itself had crystallized during the quiet hours before dawn, as she'd sat in her kitchen calculating and recalculating numbers that simply didn't work. No matter how she approached the mathematics of her situation, the conclusion was the same. Supporting Robert and his dogs would push her past the breaking point financially. But mathematics, Sarah had realized, wasn't the only way to measure what was possible. Her first call was to Henderson's General Store, where she was scheduled to work later that morning. Tom Henderson answered on the 3rd ring, his voice thick with sleep and concern. "Sarah, everything okay?" "It's pretty early for—" "Tom, I need to talk to you about something important," Sarah interrupted, then took a deep breath and explained the situation she'd discovered in her garage. She told him about Robert's condition, the dogs, and the decision she'd made to provide them with shelter until a permanent solution could be found. Tom Henderson had known Sarah for 15 years, had watched her care for half the elderly residents in Millbrook with patience and dedication that went far beyond any reasonable job description. His response didn't surprise her, but it filled her with relief nonetheless. "Take whatever time you need," he said immediately. "And Sarah, let me know what they need. Food, supplies, whatever. The store can help." The generosity in his offer brought tears to Sarah's eyes, but she also knew that Tom's business was struggling just like everyone else's in Millbrook. "I appreciate that more than you know, but I can't ask you to." "You're not asking," Tom interrupted firmly. "I'm offering. That man and his dogs are lucky you found them, and this town is lucky to have you. We'll figure out how to make this work." Sarah's second call was to Dr. Janet Morrison at the Millbrook Medical Clinic. While Robert appeared to be recovering well from his exposure, Sarah wanted professional confirmation that he didn't need immediate medical attention that she couldn't provide. Dr. Morrison listened to Sarah's description of Robert's condition and her basic treatment approach with the clinical attention of someone who dealt with hypothermia cases before. "You did exactly the right things," she assured Sarah. "Gradual rewarming, warm fluids, monitoring his consciousness level. Keep watching for any changes in his breathing or mental clarity, but it sounds like he's past the immediate danger." "What about longer-term care?" Sarah asked. "He's 73, and I don't think he's been eating regularly for weeks. Bring him in this afternoon if the roads are passable," Dr. Morrison replied. "I'll do a complete examination, make sure there aren't any underlying issues that need attention." "And Sarah, what you're doing for this man, that's exactly why I became a doctor in the first place." The third call was the most difficult. Sarah dialed the number for Martha Caldwell, the 84-year-old woman whose household management had become one of Sarah's regular responsibilities. The Caldwells depended on her for grocery shopping, medication organization, and basic household maintenance that they could no longer handle independently. "Martha, it's Sarah," she began when the elderly woman answered. "I need to explain why I might not be able to come by today, as scheduled." As Sarah described finding Robert and his dogs, she could hear Martha's sharp intake of breath and the sound of her calling to her husband Thomas. "Oh my goodness," Martha said. "That poor man. In this weather, he could have died." "He almost did," Sarah confirmed. "Martha, I know you're counting on me to help with your grocery shopping today, but don't you worry about us for 1 minute." Martha interrupted with the firm tone of someone who'd raised 6 children and knew how to prioritize. "Thomas and I will be fine for a few days. You take care of that man and his dogs. And Sarah, let us know what we can do to help." The pattern continued through each of Sarah's elderly clients. Harold Finnegan, despite his own challenges managing diabetes, offered to contribute his military pension toward Robert's care. Eleanor Pemberton, during one of her clearer moments, insisted that Sarah bring Robert and the dogs to visit because everyone needs to know they're welcome in this community. By mid-morning, as the snow finally began to taper off, Sarah realized that her decision to help Robert had activated a network of community support she hadn't known existed. Her phone kept ringing with offers of assistance from people who had heard about the situation through Millbrook's efficient informal communication system. Betty Walsh from the diner called to say she had leftover soup that would go to waste if someone didn't take it off her hands. The Methodist Church secretary, Ruth Daniels, phoned to explain that the congregation maintained a fund for exactly these kinds of emergencies. Even the Millbrook veterinarian, Dr. Kevin Barnes, reached out to offer free medical care for Charlie and Rosie, but the most surprising call came from someone Sarah barely knew, Carolyn Fitzgerald, wife of the bank president and generally regarded as Millbrook's unofficial social coordinator. Caroline had a reputation for organizing charity events and community fundraisers, but she'd never directly interacted with Sarah beyond polite greetings at the grocery store. "Sarah, I hope you don't mind me calling," Caroline began, her voice carrying an urgency that seemed uncharacteristic. "I heard about what happened, and I want you to know that you're not dealing with this alone." Caroline explained that she'd spent the morning making phone calls to various community organizations, local businesses, and individuals who might be able to contribute to Robert's support. The response had been overwhelming, but it had also revealed something troubling. "Sarah, Robert's situation isn't unique," Carolyn said. "There are more people struggling in this county than most of us realized. The economic problems, the lack of affordable housing, the gaps in social services. Your Robert is just the one who happened to end up visible." This revelation led to a conversation that would reshape Sarah's understanding of her role in the community. Caroline proposed something that had never been attempted in Millbrook, a coordinated response to homelessness and poverty that went beyond individual acts of charity to create systematic support for people who fell through the cracks of existing programs. What if Robert's situation becomes a catalyst for something bigger? Caroline suggested. What if we use this as an opportunity to build the kind of support network that could help others before they end up freezing in someone's garage? The idea was both inspiring and overwhelming. Sarah had never thought of herself as someone who could spearhead community-wide initiatives, but Caroline seemed to see possibilities that Sarah couldn't yet imagine. "I don't know anything about organizing that kind of program," Sarah admitted. "But you know everything about caring for people who need help," Caroline replied. "You've been doing it individually for years. We just need to scale up your approach and get more people involved." As Sarah ended the call with Caroline, she found Robert awake on her couch, listening with the careful attention of someone whose fate was being discussed. Charlie and Rosie had moved from the floor to join him on the narrow couch, creating a pile of warmth and companionship that made Sarah's chest tighten with emotion. "You don't have to build programs around me," Robert sighed quietly. "I know I'm just one person, and there are limits to what anyone can do." Sarah sat down in her armchair, studying Robert's face and seeing not just gratitude, but the kind of resignation that came from years of being told that his needs were too complicated, too expensive, or simply too inconvenient for society to address. "Robert," she said firmly, "you're not just one person. You're someone's father, someone's neighbor, someone who worked for 42 years and paid taxes and contributed to your community. The fact that the system failed you doesn't make you less deserving of help." Over lunch, a hearty vegetable soup that Betty Walsh had delivered along with homemade bread and a bag of dog food, Sarah outlined the various offers of support that had poured in throughout the morning. Robert listened with expressions that shifted between amazement and disbelief. "I don't understand," he said finally. "These people don't know me. Why would they want to help?" Sarah thought about that question as she watched Charlie and Rosie share a bowl of water, their tails wagging for the first time since she'd found them. "I think it's because helping you helps all of us," she said slowly. "It makes us the kind of community we want to live in." The afternoon brought Dr. Morrison's house call, something she normally reserved for her most critically ill patients. She examined Robert thoroughly, checked his heart and lungs, and drew blood for tests that would reveal whether his weeks of inadequate nutrition had caused any serious health problems. "His blood pressure is elevated, probably from stress, and he's definitely malnourished," Dr. Morrison reported to Sarah privately. "But nothing that can't be addressed with proper food, rest, and stability. The bigger concern is his mental health. He's carrying trauma from losing his wife, his home, and his sense of security. That's going to take time to heal." Dr. Morrison also examined Charlie and Rosie, pronouncing them underweight but otherwise healthy. "They've been taking good care of each other," she observed. "Dogs like this, who stay loyal under difficult circumstances, they're special." As evening approached, Sarah found herself reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed in less than 24 hours. Her house felt different with Robert and the dogs in it warmer somehow, despite the increased heating costs she couldn't afford. There was a sense of purpose and community that she hadn't experienced since her parents were alive. But she also understood that the initial wave of community support, generous as it was, wouldn't sustain itself without organization and ongoing commitment. The groceries, the offers of help, the veterinary care, these were wonderful gestures. But Robert needed more than temporary charity. He needed what everyone needed: security, dignity, and a sense of belonging. The conversation with Caroline Fitzgerald had planted a seed that was growing throughout the day. What if Robert's crisis could become the foundation for something that would help not just him, but others who were struggling in silence throughout the county? As Sarah prepared dinner for 4 instead of 1, using supplies that had been donated by people she barely knew. She began to envision possibilities that went far beyond her small house and limited resources. Perhaps her decision to help Robert wasn't just about saving 3 lives from a snowstorm. Perhaps it was about discovering what a community could accomplish when its members decided that everyone's survival mattered. The woman who had spent years caring for individuals was beginning to understand that sometimes individual problems required community solutions, and that the most powerful changes often began with someone simply deciding to open their door to a stranger in need. Outside, the snow had finally stopped falling, but inside Sarah's house, something much more significant was just beginning to grow. 3 days after the snowstorm ended, Sarah's small house had become the unofficial headquarters for what Carolyn Fitzgerald was calling the Millbrook Community Care Initiative. What had begun as an emergency response to 1 man and 2 dogs had evolved into something none of them had anticipated, a grassroots effort to address homelessness and poverty that was attracting attention from across the county. The transformation had happened gradually, then all at once. It started with Caroline arriving at Sarah's door with a clipboard, a folder full of contact information, and a determination that surprised everyone who knew her primarily as a social organizer for charity galas and church fundraisers. "Been making calls," Caroline announced as she settled into Sarah's kitchen, accepting a cup of coffee while Charlie and Rosie investigated her shoes with polite curiosity. "There are 17 families in this county who are either homeless or one emergency away from losing their housing. 17 that we know about." Sarah felt the weight of that number settling in her chest. 17 families meant dozens of people, possibly including children, who were living with the same vulnerability that had nearly killed Robert. The scope of need was overwhelming, but Caroline's expression suggested she saw opportunity rather than impossibility. "How do you know about 17 families?" Robert asked from his position at the kitchen table, where he'd been helping Sarah organize medication schedules for her elderly clients. In the 3 days since his rescue, he'd insisted on contributing to household tasks, and his mechanical skills had already proved invaluable for fixing small problems around the house that Sarah couldn't afford to have professionally repaired. Church records, school counselor reports, conversations with social workers in the county seat, Carolyn explained. "Once you start asking the right questions, you discover that a lot of people have been struggling in silence, trying to handle problems that are too big for individual solutions." Sarah absorbed this information while calculating the mathematical impossibility of helping 17 families with resources that were already stretched beyond sustainability for helping 1 man and 2 dogs. But Caroline seemed to be thinking several steps ahead of current limitations. "I've been researching similar programs in other counties," Carolyn continued, spreading documents across Sarah's kitchen table. "There are models for community-supported housing, cooperative assistance programs, and coordinated resource sharing that could work here if we can get enough people involved." The documents Carolyn had brought were impressive in their scope and detail. She'd contacted organizations in 3 neighboring states, spoken with social workers who specialized in rural poverty, and assembled information about grant funding, volunteer coordination, and partnership development that went far beyond anything Sarah had imagined possible. "Carolyn," Sarah said carefully, "this is incredible research, but I'm not sure I'm the right person to coordinate something this complex. I'm barely managing to take care of the people who already depend on me." Caroline looked up from her papers with an expression that was both understanding and determined. "Sarah, you've been coordinating complex care for multiple people for years. You've built relationships throughout this community. You understand people's needs, and you've proven that you can make decisions under pressure that save lives. Those are exactly the skills this kind of program requires." Robert had been listening to this conversation with growing amazement. "Ma'am," he said to Caroline, "I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I don't want to be the cause of Sarah taking on more than she can handle." She's already done more for me than anyone had a right to expect. Carolyn turned to Robert with the kind of direct attention that made it clear she'd been thinking about his role in the developing program. Robert, what if helping you was just the beginning? What if your experience could help us create something that prevents other people from ending up in the situation you were in? The idea seemed to both intrigue and overwhelm Robert. I don't know what I could contribute to something like that. I'm just an old factory worker who couldn't manage to keep a roof over his head. You're someone who's navigated the system that's supposed to help people in crisis, Carolyn replied. You know exactly where it fails and what people actually need. That knowledge is invaluable for designing programs that work. Over the following hour, Caroline outlined her vision for a community support network that would address not just emergency housing, but the underlying factors that created housing instability in the first place. The program would include temporary shelter, job placement assistance, medical care coordination, and what she called dignity preservation, ensuring that people receiving help maintained their sense of self-worth and community belonging. The key, Caroline explained, is making this about community investment rather than charity. People contribute according to their abilities and receive support according to their needs. Everyone has something to offer, whether it's professional skills, physical labor, financial resources, or lived experience. Sarah found herself simultaneously inspired and terrified by the scope of Caroline's proposal. The woman she'd known primarily as the bank president's wife who organized elegant fundraising events was revealing herself to be someone with sophisticated understanding of social programs and community development. How do you know so much about this? Sarah asked. Caroline's expression grew more personal, and for the first time since arriving, she seemed uncertain about how much to reveal. My brother was homeless for 3 years, she said quietly. In Denver, after he came back from Afghanistan with PTSD and couldn't hold a job. The programs that were supposed to help him either had waiting lists, eligibility requirements he couldn't meet, or services that didn't address his actual needs. The admission hung in the air, explaining Caroline's urgency and her detailed knowledge of how support systems failed the people they were designed to serve. Sarah realized that Caroline's interest in helping Robert wasn't abstract charity, but came from personal understanding of how quickly someone could fall through the cracks of society's safety net. Is your brother okay now? Robert asked gently. He is, Caroline replied. But it took a community organization in Denver, run by veterans who understood what he was going through, to help him get stable. That's when I realized that the most effective programs are usually created by people who've lived through the problems they're trying to solve. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at Sarah's door. Through the window, she could see Tom Henderson from the general store, accompanied by Dr. Morrison and 2 people she didn't recognize, a middle-aged woman in a professional suit, and a younger man carrying what appeared to be surveying equipment. Looks like the cavalry has arrived, Carolyn said with a smile that suggested she'd been expecting additional visitors. Tom Henderson made introductions as the group settled into Sarah's living room, which was rapidly becoming too small for the meetings that seemed to be occurring there regularly. The woman in the suit was Janet Reynolds, a social worker from the county health department. The young man was David Chen, a graduate student in social work who was researching rural poverty solutions for his thesis. We've heard about what's happening here, Janet Reynolds began, and we wanted to discuss how the county might be able to support your efforts. Sarah looked around her living room, filled with people discussing programs and policies that had grown out of her simple decision to help a man and 2 dogs who were freezing to death. The scope of attention was both gratifying and overwhelming. I'm not sure we have efforts yet, Sarah said honestly. We're still figuring out how to help Robert. And now Caroline is talking about programs that are much bigger than anything I know how to organize. David Chun looked up from the notes he'd been taking. Actually, what you've already accomplished is exactly the kind of organic community response that Research shows to be most effective for addressing complex social problems. You've identified need, mobilized resources, and created collaborative relationships that cross traditional social boundaries. Janet Reynolds nodded in agreement. The county has funding available for community-initiated programs, especially ones that demonstrate local support and realistic planning. What Caroline has described could qualify for grants that would make the difference between a good idea and a sustainable program. The meeting continued for 2 hours with discussions of budgets, volunteer coordination, space requirements, and regulatory compliance that made Sarah's head spin. But throughout the complex planning discussions, she kept returning to the fundamental question of whether she was the right person to coordinate something this ambitious. Her doubts were interrupted by Robert, who had been quietly listening to the detailed program discussions. "Sarah," he said during a break in the conversation, "can I talk to you privately for a minute?" They stepped into Sarah's kitchen, where Charlie and Rosie were sleeping peacefully by the space heater. Robert's expression was serious but not troubled. "I want you to know that if you decide this program is too much to take on, I'll understand," he began. "You've already saved my life and given me hope I thought I'd lost forever. Whatever you decide about these bigger plans, you don't owe me or anyone else more than you've already given." Sarah felt tears threatening at the genuine care in Robert's voice. "That's not what I'm worried about," she replied. "I'm worried about taking on responsibility for helping people, and then failing them because I don't have the skills or resources to do it properly." Robert considered this carefully. "You know what I learned during those weeks when I was sleeping in my car and then living on the streets? The difference between programs that work and programs that don't isn't usually about resources or professional qualifications. It's about whether the people running them actually care about the people they're serving." He gestured toward the living room where the planning meeting was continuing. "All those people are here because they saw how you cared for me and my dogs when you had every reason to turn us away. That's not something you learn in school or get from having money. That's something you either have or you don't." As they returned to the living room, Sarah realized that Robert was right about one fundamental point. The program Caroline was proposing had grown out of relationships and trust that already existed, not from abstract planning or institutional mandates. The question wasn't whether she was qualified to run a formal social program, but whether the community support network she'd accidentally activated could be formalized and expanded to help others. The meeting concluded with tentative agreements about next steps. Carolyn would continue researching funding and regulatory requirements. Janet Reynolds would explore county support and grant opportunities. David Chun would document their developing model for his thesis research, which would provide academic credibility for future funding applications. Most importantly, Sarah would continue doing what she'd been doing, caring for people who needed help while gradually expanding her coordination role as resources and support became available. As the visitors departed, leaving behind folders of information and lists of contacts, Sarah found herself alone with Robert and the dogs for the first time since Caroline's initial visit. The quiet felt almost strange after days of meetings and planning discussions. "Are you scared?" Robert asked as they cleaned up the coffee cups and reorganized Sarah's living room furniture. Sarah considered the question honestly. "Terrified," she admitted, "but also excited. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm working toward something bigger than just surviving day to day." Robert nodded with understanding. "That's how I felt when Helen and I got married." He sighed, scared about taking on responsibility for someone else's happiness, but excited about building something together. As evening settled over Millbrook, Sarah sat in her kitchen looking at the folders of program information Caroline had left behind. The scope of what they were considering was enormous: coordinated housing assistance for multiple families, job placement programs, medical care coordination, and support services that could serve hundreds of people across the county. But at the center of all the complex planning documents was a simple principle that Sarah understood completely. Communities worked best when their members took care of each other, and the most powerful changes often began with someone deciding that everyone's survival mattered. The woman who had answered a mysterious sound in her garage was beginning to understand that her decision to help Robert hadn't just saved 3 lives. It had revealed possibilities for community cooperation that could transform how Millbrook responded to its most vulnerable residents. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight, as Charlie and Rosie settled into their comfortable routine and Robert worked on household repairs that saved Sarah money she couldn't afford to spend, the foundation was being laid for something that none of them could have imagined a week earlier. The sound that had drawn Sarah into the snow was becoming the catalyst for changes that would echo through their community for years to come. 2 weeks after the county meeting, Sarah received a phone call that would test every principle and system they'd been developing. It was 6:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, and the voice on the other end belonged to Pastor Williams from the Baptist Church in the neighboring town of Cedar Falls. "Miss Mitchell, I hope I'm not calling too early," Pastor Williams began, his voice carrying an urgency that made Sarah immediately alert. "I heard about what you've been doing for homeless folks, and I have a situation here that I don't know how to handle." Sarah poured herself coffee while listening to Pastor Williams explain that a family had arrived at his church the previous evening, a mother with 3 children, ages 6, 9, and 12, who had been living in their car for the past month after being evicted from their apartment. The family had been surviving on fast food and sleeping in parking lots, moving frequently to avoid police attention. "The mother's name is Lisa Patterson," Pastor Williams continued. "She's been working 2 part-time jobs, but she couldn't make rent after her car needed emergency repairs. She's been trying to get into assistance programs, but there are waiting lists for everything, and most temporary shelters don't accommodate families with boys over 10. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she absorbed the details. A family with children represented challenges far more complex than Robert's situation. There were legal requirements for child welfare, educational considerations, and safety issues. That would require resources and expertise they hadn't yet developed. "Where are they now?" Sarah asked. "Sleeping in our church basement, but that's not a long-term solution. The deacons are concerned about liability issues, and honestly, our facilities aren't equipped for families with children. I was hoping you might have suggestions for how to help them." Sarah looked around her small house where Robert was already using the living room as his bedroom, and her resources were stretched to accommodate 1 additional adult and 2 dogs. Taking in a family of 4 was mathematically impossible, but the alternative, telling Pastor Williams there was nothing she could do, felt equally impossible. "Let me make some calls," Sarah said. "Can they stay where they are for today while we figure out options?" "Yes, but Miss Mitchell, there's something else you should know. Word is getting around about families in crisis, and I've gotten calls from 2 other churches about similar situations. There's a veteran with PTSD who's been sleeping in his truck, and an elderly woman whose family put her out after she couldn't pay her share of living expenses. People are starting to look to churches for help, but most of us don't have the resources or knowledge to provide what these folks actually need." Sarah ended the call with a growing understanding that their informal community support network was about to face its first major test. The success or failure of their response to the Patterson family would determine whether the program Caroline had envisioned could actually function under real-world pressure. Her first call was to Caroline, who answered on the second ring despite the early hour. "Sarah, what's happening?" Sarah explained the situation while Caroline listened with the focused attention of someone mentally calculating resources and possibilities. When Sarah finished, Caroline was quiet for a moment. "Okay," Caroline said finally. "This is what we've been preparing for, even if it's happening sooner than we expected. The county funding won't be available for another month, but we have enough community pledges to cover immediate expenses. The question is housing. My house can't accommodate a family of 4, Sarah said. And even if it could, I don't think it's appropriate to mix that many people in such a small space. Agreed. But remember what Janet Reynolds mentioned about emergency housing vouchers. Let me call her and see if we can access those immediately rather than waiting for the formal program to launch. Caroline's efficiency in crisis management was impressive. Within 2 hours, she'd contacted the county social services office, arranged for emergency housing vouchers that would cover a week in a local motel, and mobilized volunteers from 3 different churches to provide meals, clothing, and transportation for the Patterson family. But the most significant development came from an unexpected source. Tom Henderson called Sarah at 10 a.m. with a proposal that surprised everyone involved. "Sarah, I've been talking to my wife about the situation with this family," Tom began. "We have that apartment above the store that we've been using for storage. It's not fancy, but it's got 2 bedrooms, a bathroom, and a kitchen. We'd be willing to let them stay there temporarily if you think it would help." Sarah felt tears of gratitude threatening. Tom's offer represented exactly the kind of community response they'd been hoping to develop, people contributing according to their abilities to address shared problems. "Tom, that's incredibly generous, but I can't ask you to." "You're not asking," Tom interrupted, echoing his response from the first day she'd called about Robert. "Margaret and I have been talking about how to get more involved in what you're doing. This seems like a good way to start." By noon, Sarah found herself coordinating a complex operation involving multiple volunteers, county officials, and church representatives. Caroline had arranged for Janet Reynolds to meet the Patterson family and assess their eligibility for various assistance programs. Dr. Morrison had volunteered to provide medical examinations for the children. The school district had been contacted about immediate enrollment for the kids, ensuring they wouldn't fall further behind academically. But the most challenging aspect of the situation wasn't logistical, it was emotional. When Sarah met Lisa Patterson that afternoon, she found herself face to face with a woman whose circumstances reflected every parent's worst nightmare. Lisa was 34 years old, the same age as Sarah, with shoulder-length brown hair that showed signs of infrequent professional care, and clothes that were clean but clearly purchased at thrift stores. Her children, Emma, age 6, Marcus, age 9, and Tyler, age 12, stayed close to their mother with the watchful wariness of kids who'd learned that adults couldn't always protect them from life's hardships. "I want you to know that this is temporary," Lisa said immediately when introductions were made. "I'm not looking for charity. I just need help getting back on my feet so I can take care of my kids properly." Sarah recognized the defensive pride in Lisa's voice, the same tone she'd heard from Robert when he'd insisted he didn't want to be anyone's burden. It was the voice of someone who'd been forced to accept help but was determined to maintain whatever dignity the situation allowed. "Lisa, what happened to put you in this situation?" Sarah asked gently, "if you don't mind me asking." Lisa's story unfolded over coffee in the church basement, while her children colored with supplies Pastor Williams had provided. She'd been working as a nurse's aide at a local care facility until budget cuts eliminated her position 6 months earlier. She'd found 2 part-time jobs, one at a grocery store, another cleaning offices, but the combined income was barely enough to cover rent, utilities, and basic necessities. "I was managing okay until my car broke down," Lisa explained. "The transmission needed to be rebuilt, which cost $1,800. I had to choose between fixing the car so I could get to work or paying rent. I chose the car, thinking I could make up the rent the next month, but once you're behind, the late fees and penalties make it impossible to catch up." The mathematics of Lisa's situation were brutally clear. Working 2 part-time jobs without benefits, she was trapped in the economic reality that affected millions of families earning too much to qualify for most assistance programs but too little to achieve genuine stability. One unexpected expense had toppled her carefully balanced survival strategy. What about the children's father? Caroline asked carefully. Lisa's expression hardened slightly. He pays child support when he remembers to, which is maybe 3 months out of the year. I can't depend on money that might or might not show up. As Sarah listened to Lisa's story, she realized that the Patterson family represented a different category of need than Robert's situation. Robert was elderly, alone, and had exhausted his resources through circumstances largely beyond his control. Lisa was a working mother whose crisis stemmed from the structural inadequacies of low-wage employment and the absence of safety nets for families facing temporary emergencies. The apartment above Tom's store is available starting tomorrow, Sarah told Lisa. It's not permanent, but it gives us time to work on longer-term solutions. Lisa's relief was visible, but it was tempered by practical concerns. I appreciate that more than I can say, but I need to know what the expectations are. How much is rent? How long can we stay? What happens if I can't find better employment quickly enough? Caroline had anticipated these questions and had spent the morning developing what she called a partnership agreement rather than a traditional rental arrangement. You'd contribute what you can afford toward utilities and maintenance, Caroline explained. In exchange for reduced housing costs, you'd help coordinate services for other families we're working with. Your healthcare background would be valuable for helping people navigate medical systems. The proposal was innovative, transforming Lisa from a recipient of charity into a contributing partner in the community support program. Sarah could see that the arrangement preserved Lisa's dignity while addressing practical needs for both the family and the broader program. You'd want me to help other people while you're helping me? Lisa asked, her expression showing surprise and growing interest. We'd want you to help us build something that prevents other families from ending up in the situation you're in, Sarah replied. Your experience navigating assistance programs, dealing with employers, managing a household on limited income, that knowledge is exactly what we need to design services that actually work. Over the following hours, Sarah watched Lisa transform from defensive desperation to cautious hope as the details of her family's immediate future were organized. The children would start school the next day. Lisa would retain her current part-time jobs while exploring additional employment opportunities. The family would have stable housing while working toward independent living arrangements. But the most significant change was in Lisa's role. Instead of being a passive recipient of help, she was being invited to become a partner in developing solutions for other families facing similar crises. The arrangement addressed both her immediate needs and her longer-term goal of regaining self-sufficiency. As evening approached and the Patterson family prepared to move into their temporary housing, Sarah found herself reflecting on how much their community support network had evolved since that snowy morning when she'd found Robert in her garage. They'd gone from emergency response to systematic intervention, from individual charity to community partnership. Sarah, Robert said as they returned to her house after helping the Pattersons settle into their new accommodations, you realize what just happened today, don't you? Sarah looked at Robert, noting that his color had continued to improve and that he'd gained weight since his rescue. Charlie and Rosie trotted beside them, their tails wagging as they recognized the familiar path home. What do you mean? Today wasn't just about helping one family, Robert replied. Today was about proving that what you started with me can actually work for other people in different situations. You didn't just save Lisa and her kids, you showed them how to become part of saving others. As they entered Sarah's house, which had become the unofficial headquarters for what was rapidly becoming a county-wide initiative, Sarah realized that Robert was right. The Patterson family crisis had been their first real test, and they'd passed it not through heroic individual effort, but through coordinated community response that preserved dignity while addressing practical needs. The sound that had drawn Her into the snow that February morning was becoming an echo that reached families throughout the region, calling them toward the security and belonging that everyone deserved, but too few were able to find on their own. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight, Sarah fell asleep knowing that Lisa's children were warm and safe, that their mother had hope for the future, and that their family's crisis had become another stepping stone toward building the kind of community where no one had to face their worst moments alone. 6 weeks after rescuing Robert from her garage, Sarah faced a crisis that threatened to destroy everything they'd built. It started with a phone call at 5:45 a.m. from Lisa Patterson, her voice tight with panic that immediately jolted Sarah awake. "Sarah, I need help," Lisa said without preamble. "Tyler's been arrested." Sarah sat up in bed, her mind racing to process this information. Tyler Patterson, Lisa's 12-year-old son, had been adjusting well to his new school and seemed to be thriving in the stability of the apartment above Tom Henderson's store. The idea of him being arrested seemed impossible. Arrested for what? Sarah asked, pulling on clothes as she spoke. "Shoplifting," Lisa replied, her voice breaking. "At Henderson's store. Tom caught him taking candy bars and called the police instead of calling me. The social worker says they might remove all 3 kids from my custody because this shows I can't supervise them properly." Sarah felt her world tilt sideways. The irony was devastating. Tyler had been caught stealing from the very store whose owner had provided their family with housing. The situation threatened not only the Patterson family stability, but also the relationships of trust that were fundamental to their entire community support program. "Where are you now?" Sarah asked, grabbing her keys and heading for the door. "At the police station in town. They're holding Tyler until his court hearing this afternoon, and I have to meet with Child Protective Services at 9 o'clock. Sarah, if they take my kids, I don't know what I'll do." As Sarah drove through the pre-dawn darkness toward town, her mind churned through the implications of this crisis. If Tyler's arrest led to the Patterson children being removed from Lisa's custody, it would validate every skeptic who had questioned their community support program. People would say that informal assistance enabled poor decision-making, that families in crisis needed professional oversight rather than community partnership. But Sarah also understood the deeper dynamics at play. Tyler Patterson was a 12-year-old boy who had lived in a car for a month, watching his mother work multiple jobs while struggling to provide basic necessities for her children. The trauma of homelessness didn't disappear overnight. Just because housing had been secured, Sarah's first stop was Henderson's general store, where she found Tom opening the shop with movements that seemed heavier than usual. His expression when he saw her was a mixture of regret and defensive frustration. "Sarah, I'm sorry about calling the police," Tom began before she could speak. "But I couldn't just ignore it when I caught him stuffing candy bars into his backpack. If word gets around that kids can steal from my store without consequences, I'll have problems with every teenager in town." Sarah understood Tom's position, but she also saw the larger picture that he might be missing. "Tom, I'm not questioning your right to protect your business. But Tyler isn't just any kid. He's a boy who was homeless 6 weeks ago, living in a car, watching his mother choose between food and gas money. Sometimes kids from traumatic situations act out in ways that don't make logical sense." Tom's expression shifted as he considered this perspective. "I didn't think about it that way," he admitted. "I just saw a kid stealing and reacted the way I would with any shoplifter." "What exactly did you see?" Sarah asked. "Can you walk me through what happened?" Tom described finding Tyler in the candy aisle with 3 chocolate bars hidden in his backpack. When confronted, Tyler had become defensive and tried to leave the store without explanation. Tom had interpreted this as typical juvenile delinquency, but Sarah recognized it as the behavior of a child who had learned that admitting need often led to shame and rejection. "Tom, what if we approach this differently?" Sarah suggested. What if instead of seeing Tyler as a kid who steals, we see him as a kid who hasn't learned yet that he doesn't have to hoard food because there will always be enough? The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Carolyn Fitzgerald, who had received Sarah's emergency call and driven directly to the store. Caroline's expression was grim as she assessed the situation. "How bad is this?" she asked without preamble. "Bad enough," Sarah replied. "CPS is reviewing the family's case. Tyler's facing juvenile court, and our entire program is about to be judged based on one 12-year-old's poor decision." Caroline absorbed this information with the strategic thinking that had made her invaluable to their program development. Okay, we need to manage this crisis on multiple levels. Legal support for Tyler, advocacy with Child Protective Services for Lisa, and damage control for our community relationships. Over the following hours, Caroline demonstrated why her organizational skills had been crucial to their program's growth. She contacted a family law attorney who volunteered with their initiative, arranged for Dr. Morrison to provide a professional assessment of Tyler's behavioral needs, and coordinated with Janet Reynolds from the county to ensure that CPS understood the context of the family situation. But the most significant intervention came from an unexpected source. Robert Henley. Sarah found Robert at the police station when she arrived to support Lisa, sitting quietly in the waiting area with Charlie and Rosie at his feet. He'd somehow learned about the crisis and had walked the 2 miles from Sarah's house to offer whatever help he could provide. "Robert, you didn't have to come here," Sarah said, touched by his presence but concerned about the effort it had required. "Yes, I did," Robert replied firmly. "That boy is part of our family now, just like Lisa and her other kids. When family members are in trouble, you show up." Robert's simple statement captured something essential about what their community support program had become. It wasn't just a service organization helping random people in crisis. It was a chosen family that included everyone who had been welcomed into the circle of mutual care and responsibility. The court hearing that afternoon proved to be a turning point in ways none of them had anticipated. Judge Patricia Morales, a woman in her 50s who had been presiding over juvenile cases for 15 years, listened to the standard shoplifting charges with the weary attention of someone who had seen similar situations hundreds of times. But when Caroline and the family law attorney presented Tyler's case in context explaining his recent homelessness, his family's participation in the community support program, and the trauma-informed perspective on his behavior, Judge Morales became genuinely interested. "Tell me more about this community support program," Judge Morales said, addressing Caroline directly. "This is the first time I've heard about systematic community intervention for families in crisis in this county." Caroline's presentation of their program was masterful. She described how individual acts of kindness had evolved into coordinated community response, how partnerships preserved dignity while addressing practical needs, and how people who received help became contributors to helping others. She emphasized that Tyler's shoplifting incident was being treated not as evidence of program failure, but as an opportunity for therapeutic intervention within a supportive community context. Judge Morales asked detailed questions about program oversight, outcome measurement, and sustainability, questions that Caroline answered with surprising sophistication. Sarah realized that Caroline had been preparing for exactly this kind of scrutiny, understanding that their informal program would eventually need to demonstrate its effectiveness to skeptical authorities. "Mr. Patterson," Judge Morales said, addressing Tyler directly, "do you understand why taking things without paying for them is wrong?" Tyler, who had been silent throughout most of the proceedings, looked up with eyes that seemed older than his. 12 years. Yes, ma'am. I just ... I was scared there wouldn't be enough food again, so I wanted to save some candy for later." The honesty in Tyler's response created a moment of silence in the courtroom. Judge Morales leaned forward slightly, her expression softening. Tyler, what would help you feel more secure about having enough food? Tyler glanced at his mother, then at Sarah and Carolyn before answering. Maybe if I could help earn money. For groceries, like doing chores or helping with work. Then I'd know we could always buy what we need. Judge Morales smiled for the first time during the hearing. I think that's an excellent idea. Mrs. Patterson, is your son regularly involved in contributing to your household's functioning? Lisa nodded eagerly. He helps with his younger siblings, and he's been learning to cook simple meals. He's actually very responsible for his age. The judge's final ruling surprised everyone involved. Instead of traditional juvenile penalties, she sentenced Taylor to 40 hours of community service, to be completed through volunteer work with the community support program that had helped his family. The sentence would allow Tyler to contribute meaningfully to helping other families, while learning about community responsibility and mutual aid. I want to see this program in action, Judge Morales told Caroline as the hearing concluded. If it's as effective as you've described, it might serve as a model for other communities in our judicial district. As they left the courthouse, Sarah felt emotionally exhausted, but also profoundly relieved. The crisis that could have destroyed their program had instead provided an opportunity to demonstrate its values and effectiveness to someone with the authority to help expand its reach. But the most meaningful moment came later that evening, when Tyler Patterson knocked on Sarah's door with a carefully written letter of apology for Tom Henderson and a request to speak with Robert about how to be better when people are helping you. Sarah found Tyler and Robert sitting on her front porch with Charlie and Rosie lying peacefully at their feet. Robert was speaking in the gentle voice he used when sharing difficult truths. The hardest part about accepting help, Robert was telling Tyler, is learning to trust that it's going to continue. When you've been without food or shelter, your body remembers that feeling even after you're safe. It takes time for your mind to catch up with your circumstances. Tyler listened with the focused attention of someone receiving wisdom that addressed his deepest fears. How long does it take? He asked. Different for everyone, Robert replied. But the good news is that while you're learning to trust, you could also learn to help other people who are going through what you went through. That's how you know you're really safe, when you have enough security to share it with others. As Sarah watched this conversation unfold, she realized that Tyler's crisis had revealed something crucial about their community support program. It wasn't just about providing services to people in need. It was about creating relationships that could withstand mistakes, misunderstandings, and the complex challenges that came with healing from trauma. The shoplifting incident that could have ended Tyler's family's participation in their program had instead deepened their integration into a community that understood that healing was a process, not an event. Tom Henderson had learned about trauma-informed responses to challenging behavior. Judge Morales had discovered a community program worth supporting and expanding. Tyler had found mentorship from someone who understood his fears because he'd lived through similar experiences. Most importantly, their entire network had proved that it could survive a crisis without abandoning the people who needed help the most. The sound that had drawn Sarah into the snow months earlier was becoming an echo of resilience that reached not just families in crisis, but the institutions and systems that were supposed to serve them. As the evening settled over Millbrook, Sarah looked out at a community that had been transformed by the simple decision to help a man and 2 dogs who were freezing to death. Tyler's crisis had tested every relationship and principle they'd developed, and all of them had emerged stronger. The woman who had answered a cry for help in her garage was learning that building community meant not just opening doors for people in crisis, but keeping those doors open when the people you'd welcomed made mistakes that tested everyone's patience and commitment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Tyler Patterson was learning from Robert Henley that security came not from hoarding resources, but from trusting that a community would continue to care even when its members weren't perfect. 3 months after Judge Morales had sentenced Tyler Patterson to community service within their support program, Sarah received a phone call that would elevate their grassroots initiative to a level of recognition none of them had dared to imagine. The caller was Dr. Amanda Foster, Director of Rural Community Development for the state's Department of Social Services. "Ms. Mitchell," Dr. Foster began, her voice carrying the professional warmth of someone accustomed to delivering significant news. "I've been reviewing reports about the community support program you've developed in Millbrook. Judge Morales has provided extensive documentation about your intervention model, and frankly, what you've accomplished is remarkable." Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate as she absorbed the implications of this call. State-level attention meant either unprecedented opportunity or unwelcome scrutiny, and she wasn't sure which possibility concerned her more. "Dr. Foster, I appreciate Judge Morales' support, but I want to be clear that what we're doing here isn't really a formal program. It's more like neighbors helping neighbors in a coordinated way." Dr. Foster's laugh was genuine and warm. "Ms. Mitchell, that's exactly why it's remarkable. You've created what academic researchers spend years trying to design: a sustainable, community-driven response to homelessness and poverty that preserves dignity while addressing root causes. The state would like to study your model and potentially replicate it in other rural counties." The conversation that followed would reshape Sarah's understanding of what they'd been building. Dr. Foster explained that rural communities across the state were struggling with increasing homelessness, inadequate mental health services, and economic displacement that traditional social programs weren't equipped to address effectively. "Most assistance programs are designed for urban environments," Dr. Foster continued. "They assume access to public transportation, multiple service providers, and population densities that support specialized programs. Rural communities need different approaches, and what you've developed appears to address many of the gaps we've identified." Sarah found herself simultaneously flattered and overwhelmed by this recognition. "Dr. Foster, what exactly would state involvement mean for our community? We've been operating on trust and informal relationships. I'm not sure how that would translate to government oversight." "That's exactly what we want to preserve," Dr. Foster assured her. "We're not interested in taking over your program or imposing bureaucratic requirements that would undermine its effectiveness. What we'd like to do is document your model, provide funding support, and help other communities adapt your approach to their specific circumstances." The proposal Dr. Foster outlined was both exciting and intimidating. The state would provide a $150,000 grant to formalize their program structure, hire additional coordinators, and create replication materials for other communities. In exchange, they would participate in a comprehensive study documenting their methods, outcomes, and lessons learned. "I'll need to discuss this with my team," Sarah said, though she realized as she spoke that calling Caroline, Robert, Lisa, and the others her team reflected how much their relationships had evolved from emergency response to systematic collaboration. "Of course," Dr. Foster replied. "But Ms. Mitchell, I want you to understand something important. Programs like yours usually take years to develop and millions of dollars in planning grants. You've created something organically that addresses problems most professional programs struggle to solve. That's not just impressive, it's revolutionary." After ending the call, Sarah sat in her kitchen staring at her phone, trying to process the magnitude of what Dr. Foster had proposed. State recognition would provide resources they desperately needed, but might also change the intimate, relationship-based character that made their program effective. She was interrupted by Robert entering through the back door, returning from his morning walk with Charlie and Rosie. In the months since his rescue, Robert had become Sarah's informal partner in coordinating daily program activities. His combination of practical skills, emotional intelligence, and lived experience with homelessness had made him invaluable for working with new families entering their support network. You look like someone who just received news that's either very good or very bad, Robert observed. Settling into his usual chair at Sarah's kitchen table. Sarah explained Dr. Foster's call, while Robert listened with the careful attention he brought to all serious conversations. When she finished, he was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications. "What does your gut tell you about this?" Robert asked finally. "I'm excited about the resources and the possibility of helping other communities," Sarah replied. "Honestly, but I'm also scared that state involvement might change what makes our program work. The bureaucracy, the reporting requirements, the pressure to show measurable outcomes. I don't know if our approach would survive that kind of scrutiny." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "You know what I learned during my years working in the factory? The difference between programs that help people and programs that help organizations look good is usually about who gets to make the decisions." His insight captured Sarah's deepest concern about state involvement. Their program worked because decisions were made by people who knew the families being served, understood local circumstances, and could respond quickly to changing needs. Bureaucratic oversight might improve their resources while undermining their flexibility. "What do you think we should do?" Sarah asked. "I think we should ask Lisa, Carolyn, and the others what they think," Robert replied. "This affects all of U.S., not just you." That evening, Sarah convened a meeting in the basement of the Methodist Church, the same space where Tyler Patterson had been sleeping in a car just months earlier. The gathering included everyone who had become integral to their program's operation: Carolyn Fitzgerald, Lisa Patterson, Tom Henderson, Dr. Morrison, and 12 other community members who had contributed housing, employment, or services to families in crisis. Sarah presented Dr. Foster's proposal while the group listened with expressions ranging from excitement to concern. The discussion that followed revealed the complexity of their decision and the different perspectives each person brought to the question of state involvement. Caroline was immediately enthusiastic about the recognition and resources. "This validates everything we've been building," she argued. "State support would allow us to help more families and create sustainable funding rather than relying on individual donations and volunteer time." Tom Henderson was more cautious. "I'm concerned about government regulations affecting how we make decisions. What if state requirements prevent us from responding quickly to emergencies like Robert's situation or Tyler's crisis?" Lisa Patterson offered a perspective shaped by her experience navigating social service systems as someone seeking help. "State programs have rules and waiting lists and eligibility requirements that often exclude the people who need help most," she observed. "Our program works because we can help people immediately, without asking them to prove they deserve assistance." Dr. Morrison raised medical concerns about formalization, professional liability, mandatory reporting requirements, licensing issues. State involvement might create legal obligations that change how we can interact with families in crisis. The most compelling perspective came from an unexpected source. Tyler Patterson, now 13 and transformed by his months of community service work with their program. Caroline had invited him to participate in the discussion because his experience represented both the potential and the risks of their approach. "I say something?" Tyler asked, raising his hand with the formal politeness he'd learned from Robert's mentoring. Sarah nodded encouragingly. "Of course, Tyler, your perspective is important." Tyler stood up with the self-consciousness of a teenager addressing a room full of adults, but his voice was steady and thoughtful. "Before my family got help from Ms. Sarah and everyone here, we tried to get help from regular programs. They had forms and appointments and rules about what you could bring and where you could go. But when we really needed help, like when we were sleeping in our car, none of those programs could help us right away." He paused, looking around the room at faces that had become familiar sources of support and security. "What makes this program different is that when someone needs help, you help them first and figure out the paperwork later. If you have to follow state rules, will you still be able to do that?" Tyler's question crystallized the central dilemma they faced. State support could provide resources and recognition that would expand their impact, but it might also impose constraints that would undermine the responsiveness and flexibility that made their program effective. The discussion continued for 2 hours with passionate arguments on multiple sides. Some participants believed state recognition was essential for long-term sustainability and expansion. Others worried that formalization would bureaucratize relationships that worked precisely because they were personal and immediate. Sarah found herself serving as moderator between competing visions of their program's future. But as the evening progressed, a consensus began to emerge around a middle path that none of them had initially considered. What if we negotiated conditions for state support that preserved our decision-making autonomy? Caroline suggested. Accepted. Funding and recognition while maintaining the right to operate according to our community values rather than bureaucratic requirements? Robert leaned forward with interest. You mean like a partnership where the state provides resources but doesn't control how we use them? Exactly, Caroline replied. We document our methods and outcomes for research purposes, but we maintain local control over program operations. Lisa nodded approvingly. And we insist that any expansion to other communities is done by training local people to adapt our approach rather than imposing standardized procedures. The idea that emerged from their discussion was innovative. They would accept state support while maintaining community control, participate in research while preserving operational flexibility, and share their model while resisting pressure to standardize approaches that needed to be adapted to local circumstances. This could actually strengthen what we're doing, Dr. Morrison observed. State recognition might give us credibility with other institutions, hospitals, schools, employers that could expand our ability to help families. As the meeting concluded, with tentative agreement to negotiate with Dr. Foster about conditional state partnership, Sarah reflected on how much their program had evolved since that snowy morning when she'd found Robert in her garage. They'd grown from emergency response to systematic intervention to community transformation, and now they were being recognized as a model that could influence policy and practice across the state. But the most significant development wasn't external recognition, it was the democratic decision-making process they'd just demonstrated. A group of people who had come together around shared commitment to helping neighbors in crisis had evolved into a collaborative organization capable of navigating complex decisions about their collective future. Sarah, Robert said as they walked home together after the meeting, with Charlie and Rosie trotting contentedly beside them. You realize what just happened in there, don't you? Sarah looked at Robert with curiosity. What do you mean? 3 months ago, Tyler was a scared kid who stole candy because he was afraid there wouldn't be enough food. Tonight, he stood up in front of a room full of adults and gave the most insightful analysis of our program's strengths and vulnerabilities. Robert was right. Tyler's transformation from a traumatized child acting out of fear to a thoughtful young person contributing wisdom to community decisions captured everything their program aspired to achieve. People didn't just receive help, they developed the security and confidence to become contributors to helping others. As they reached Sarah's house, which continued to serve as the informal headquarters for their expanding program, Sarah realized that state recognition was just another step in a journey that had begun with a simple decision to help a man and 2 dogs who were freezing to death. The sound that had drawn her into the snow was becoming an echo that reached state agencies, academic researchers, and policymakers who were discovering that the most effective solutions to complex social problems often emerged from communities that decided everyone's survival mattered. Tomorrow would bring negotiations with Dr. Foster about conditions for state partnership, but tonight, Sarah fell asleep knowing that their program had achieved something even more valuable than official recognition. They had created a model of community care that preserved dignity, fostered growth, and transformed everyone it touched. 1 year after Sarah Mitchell first heard the sound that would change 3 lives forever, she stood before an audience of 300 people in the state capitol building, preparing to deliver a keynote address at the annual conference on rural community development. The woman who had once struggled to afford heating bills for her small farmhouse was now being recognized as a pioneer in community-driven solutions to homelessness and poverty. But the most meaningful moment of recognition had come earlier that morning, when she'd received a text message from Tyler Patterson, now 14 and thriving in high school. The message was simple but carried the weight of transformation. "Miss Sarah, I got accepted to the State Honors Program for Community Leadership. Thank you for teaching me that helping others is how you heal yourself." As Sarah looked out at the audience of social workers, policymakers, and community organizers, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this podium. The desperate woman who had shared one heating source between multiple rooms was now addressing people who managed budgets in the millions and influenced policy for hundreds of thousands of residents. 18 months ago, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the audience, I was a woman barely making ends meet, caring for elderly neighbors because I couldn't say no when people needed help. I had no training in social work, no experience with program development, and no idea that a single decision made at 2:47 in the morning would transform not just my life, but an entire approach to community care. She described finding Robert and his dogs in her garage, the impossible mathematics of taking them in, and the community response that had grown from that initial act of kindness. But rather than focusing on the dramatic rescue story, Sarah emphasized the principles and relationships that had made their program sustainable and replicable. The Millbrook Community Care Network now serves 47 families across 3 counties, Sarah continued. We've prevented 16 evictions, helped 23 people find stable employment, and provided emergency support to over 100 individuals during various crises. But those numbers don't capture what we've really accomplished. Sarah gestured toward the audience section where Robert, Lisa, Carolyn, and others from Millbrook sat listening with pride that was visible even from the stage. What we've really created is proof that communities can solve problems that seem too big for individual effort and too complex for bureaucratic solutions. We've shown that the most effective programs are built on relationships, trust, and the revolutionary idea that everyone has something to contribute. The presentation that followed outlined their model in detail. Immediate crisis response followed by partnership development, community integration that preserved dignity, and systematic support that helped people become contributors rather than permanent recipients. Sarah described their negotiations with the state, which had resulted in funding that supported their work without controlling their methods. But the most powerful part of her presentation wasn't about systems or outcomes. It was about transformation. Robert Henley, the man I found freezing in my garage, is now our program's coordinator for veteran services, Sarah announced. His lived experience with homelessness, combined with his natural empathy and practical skills, makes him uniquely qualified to help other veterans navigate the challenges of reintegration and housing instability. She looked directly at Robert in the audience, seeing the man who had become not just a friend, but a true partner in building something meaningful. Robert has helped 12 veterans find stable housing and employment over the past year. But, more importantly, he's shown them that surviving a crisis doesn't define your worth. What you do with the stability you achieve is what matters. Sarah then spoke about Lisa Patterson, whose healthcare background and experience with family homelessness had made her invaluable for coordinating services for families with children. Lisa now manages our family support services and has developed protocols that other communities are adapting for their own programs. She's living proof that the people who've navigated complex systems while facing personal crises often understand those systems better than the professionals who designed them. The audience listened with growing attention as Sarah described Tyler's evolution from a traumatized child who stole candy to a young leader who had testified before the state legislature about the importance of trauma-informed community responses to youth in crisis. Tyler Patterson is 15 years old and has already spoken at 6 conferences about youth homelessness and community healing. Sarah said, her voice filled with maternal pride. He's been accepted to a prestigious summer program for young community organizers, and his college application essay about finding security through service has been shared with admissions counselors across the country as an example of resilience and insight. But Sarah's most emotional moment came when she spoke about the ripple effects their program had created beyond direct service delivery. Tom Henderson, who provided housing for the Patterson family above his store, has now converted the entire second floor into transitional apartments for families in crisis. Dr. Janet Morrison has established the first rural mobile medical clinic in our region, providing healthcare access to people who might otherwise go without treatment. Caroline Fitzgerald has leveraged her business connections to create employment opportunities specifically designed for people transitioning out of homelessness. Sarah paused, looking out at faces that represented communities across the state, many dealing with similar challenges to those that had once seemed overwhelming in Millbrook. But the most significant transformation hasn't been in our programs or our outcomes, she continued. It's been in our understanding of what community actually means. We've learned that security isn't something you achieve individually, it's something you create collectively. We've discovered that the most sustainable solutions to complex problems emerge when communities decide that everyone's well-being matters. The presentation concluded with Sarah outlining the expansion of their model to 8 other rural communities, each adapting their basic principles to local circumstances and needs. State funding had enabled training programs, resource sharing, and coordinated advocacy that was beginning to influence policy at the legislative level. The Millbrook model is being studied by researchers at 3 universities, Sarah announced. But more importantly, it's being lived by families who no longer have to choose between dignity and survival, by individuals who've discovered that their most difficult experiences can become their greatest contributions to helping others. The standing ovation that followed was sustained and heartfelt, but Sarah barely heard it. She was thinking about Charlie and Rosie, now healthy and content, who had become therapy dogs for children in their program. She was remembering the elderly clients who had supported her decision to help Robert, many of whom had become mentors and surrogate grandparents for families in transition. Most of all, she was reflecting on how a woman who had once felt invisible in her own life had become a voice for community-driven change that was influencing policy and practice across multiple states. After the presentation, Sarah was surrounded by people wanting to learn more about replicating their program, but the conversation that mattered most came from Dr. Foster, who had become not just a state partner, but a genuine ally in their work. "Sarah, I have news that I think will interest you," Dr. Foster said as the crowd around them began to disperse. The Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development wants to feature the Millbrook model in their next national report on innovative approaches to rural homelessness. They're considering funding pilot programs based on your approach in 10 additional states. Sarah felt a familiar mixture of excitement and responsibility. Each expansion of their recognition brought opportunities to help more people, but also pressure to maintain the relationship-based authenticity that made their program effective. "Dr. Foster, that's incredible, but I want to make sure we don't lose sight of what makes this work," Sarah replied. "The moment we start focusing more on replication than on relationships, we'll become just another program that looks good on paper, but doesn't actually transform lives." Dr. Foster smiled with understanding. "That's exactly why you're the right person to guide this expansion. You understand that the methodology isn't what makes your program work. It's the values and commitments that drive how you implement the methodology." As the conference concluded and Sarah prepared to return to Millbrook, she received dozens of business cards and invitations to speak at other events. But the message that mattered most came from Eleanor Pemberton, one of her original elderly clients, who had texted, "Saw you on the news tonight. Your parents would be so proud. Come by tomorrow. I made extra soup and there are new families that need welcome meals." On the drive home, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that snowy morning when she'd heard crying coming from her garage. The woman who had once rationed soap and counted every dollar now managed a program budget of over $200,000 and influenced policy decisions that affected thousands of people. But the most profound transformation wasn't in her external circumstances. Was in her understanding of what was possible when people chose cooperation over competition, community over individualism, and hope over resignation. As Sarah pulled into her driveway and saw lights on in her house, she knew that Robert would be inside, probably reading while Charlie and Rosie slept peacefully by the space heater that no longer represented a financial burden. The house that had once felt too expensive to heat properly now served as headquarters for a program that had proven sustainable, effective, and transformative. The next morning brought the familiar routine of coordinating services for families in crisis, but now those services were part of a systematic approach that preserved dignity while addressing root causes of instability. Sarah's phone rang regularly with calls from other communities wanting to adapt their model, from researchers requesting data about their outcomes, and from families seeking help who had heard that Millbrook was a place where people in crisis were met with partnership rather than pity. But the call that meant the most came from Lisa Patterson, now the program's family services coordinator, with news about their newest arrival, a single mother with 2 young children who had been living in her car for 3 weeks after losing her job due to COVID-related business closures. Her name is Maria Santos, Lisa reported. She's a certified nursing assistant who lost her job when the nursing home where she worked had to close temporarily. She's been trying to find new employment while keeping her kids safe and fed. Sound familiar? Sarah smiled at the parallel to Lisa's own story, understanding that Maria's crisis would become another opportunity to demonstrate that communities could respond to individual emergencies in ways that created long-term stability and mutual support. "Where is she now?" Sarah asked. "In the apartment above Henderson's store, getting her kids enrolled in school while we help her connect with healthcare facilities that need CNAs. She's already asked about how she can contribute to helping other families once she gets back on her feet." As Sarah ended the call and prepared for another day of coordinating community care, she thought about the sound that had started it all, the crying that had drawn her into the snow to rescue a man and 2 dogs who had been hours away from death. That sound had become an echo that reached across counties and states, calling communities toward the recognition that everyone's survival mattered, and that the most powerful changes began with someone deciding to answer when they heard a neighbor in need. The woman who had found Robert Henley freezing in her garage had discovered that opening your door to one person in crisis could transform an entire community's understanding of what was possible when ordinary people chose extraordinary kindness. And in small towns across multiple states, people were learning that the difference between surviving and thriving often came down to whether you faced your hardest moments alone or surrounded by a community that had decided your well-being was everyone's responsibility. The sound in the snow had become a symphony of community care that continued to grow, one rescued life at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.